Welcome to Thueringer for Farming Simulator 15. We now continue in our reading of My Antonia by Willa Cather in Book 5, Part 2. When the boys came in from milking and feeding, the long table was laid, and 2 brown geese stuffed with apples were put down sizzling before Antonia. She began to carve, and Rudolph, who sat next to his mother, started the plates on their way. When everybody was served, he looked across the table at me. "Have you been to Black Hawk lately, Mr. Burden? Then I wonder if you've heard about the Cutters?" No, I had heard nothing at all about them. "Then you must tell him, son, though it's quite a terrible thing to talk about at supper. Now all you children be quiet. Rudolph is going to tell about the murder." "Hurrah, the murder!" the children murmured, looking pleased and interested. Rudolph told his story in great detail, with occasional promptings from his mother or father. Willa Cather and his wife had gone on living in the house that Antonia and I knew so well, and in the way we knew so well. They grew to be very old people. He shriveled up, Antonia said, until he looked like a little old yellow monkey, for his beard and his fringe of hair never changed color. Mrs. Cather remained flushed and wild-eyed as we had known her, but as the years passed, she became afflicted with a shaking palsy, which made her nervous nod continuous instead of occasional. Her hands were so uncertain that she could no longer disfigure china, poor woman. As the couple grew older, they quarreled more and more about the ultimate disposition of their, quote, property. A new law was passed in the state, securing the surviving wife a third of her husband's estate under all conditions. Cather was tormented by the fear that Mrs. Cather would live longer than he, and that eventually her people, whom he had always hated so violently, would inherit. Their quarrels on this subject passed the boundary of the close-growing cedars, and were heard in the street by whoever wished to loiter and listen. One morning, 2 years ago, Cather went into the hardware store and bought a pistol, saying he was going to shoot a dog, and adding that he thought he would take a shot at an old cat while he was about it. Here the children interrupted Rudolph's narrative by smothered giggles. Cather went out behind the hardware store, put up a target, practiced for an hour or so, and then went home. At 6 o'clock that evening, when several men were passing the Cather house on their way home to supper, they heard a pistol shot. They paused and looked doubtfully at one another, then another shot came crashing through an upstairs window. They ran into the house and found Willa Cather lying on a sofa in his upstairs bedroom, with his throat torn open, bleeding on a roll of sheets he had placed beside his head. "Walk in, gentlemen," he said weakly. "I am alive, you see, and competent. You are witnesses that I have survived my wife. You will find her in her own room. Please make your examination at once, so there will be no mistake." One of the neighbors telephoned for a doctor, while the others went into Mrs. Cather's room. She was lying on her bed in her nightgown and wrapper, shot through the heart. Her husband must have come in while she was taking her afternoon nap and shot her, holding the revolver near her breast. Her nightgown was burned from the powder. The horrified neighbors rushed back to Cather. He opened his eyes and said distinctly, "Mrs. Cather is quite dead, gentlemen, and I am conscious. My affairs are in order." Then, Rudolph said, "He let go and died." On his desk, the coroner found a letter dated at 5 o'clock that afternoon. It stated that he had just shot his wife, that any will she might secretly have made would be invalid as he survived her. He meant to shoot himself at 6 o'clock and would, if he had strength, fire a shot through the window in the hope that passersby might come in and see him before life was extinct, as he wrote. Now, would you have thought that man had such a cruel heart? Antonia turned to me after the story was told. To go and do that poor woman out of any comfort she might have had from his money after he was gone. Did you ever hear of anybody else that killed himself for spite, Mr. Burden? Asked Rudolph. I admitted that I hadn't. Every lawyer learns over and over how strong a motive hate can be, but in my collection of legal anecdotes, I had nothing to match this one. When I asked how much the estate amounted to, Rudolph said it was a little over $100,000. Kuzak gave me a twinkling sidelong glance. The lawyers, they got a good deal of it, sure, he said merrily. $100,000. So that was the fortune that had been scraped together by such hard dealing, and that Cutter himself had died for in the end. After supper, Kuzak and I took a stroll in the orchard and sat down by the windmill to smoke. He told me his story as if it were my business to know it. His father was a shoemaker, his uncle a furrier, and he, being a younger son, was apprenticed to the latter's trade. You never got anywhere working for your relatives, he said, so when he was a journeyman, he went to Vienna and worked in a big fur shop, earning good money. But a young fellow who liked a good time didn't save anything in Vienna. There were too many pleasant ways of spending every night than what he'd made in the day. After 3 years there, he came to New York. He was badly advised and went to work on furs during a strike, when the factories were offering big wages. The strikers won and Kuzak was blacklisted. As he had a few $100s ahead, he decided to go to Florida and raise oranges. He had always thought he would like to raise oranges. The second year, a hard frost killed his young grove and he fell ill with malaria. He came to Nebraska to visit his cousin, Anton Jelinek, and to look about. When he began to look about, he saw Antonia, and she was exactly the kind of girl he had always been hunting for. They were married at once, though he had to borrow money from his cousin to buy the wedding ring. It was a pretty hard job breaking up this place and making the first crops grow, he said, pushing back his hat and scratching his grizzled hair. Sometimes I get awful sore on this place and want to quit. But my wife, she says, we better stick it out. The babies come along pretty fast, so it looked like it'd be hard to move anyhow. I guess she was right. All right, we got this place clear now. We pay only $20 an acre then, and I've been offered $100. We bought another quarter 10 years ago, and we got 'em most paid for. We got plenty of boys. We can work a lot of land. Yeah, she is a good wife for a poor man. She ain't always so strict with me neither. Sometimes maybe I drink a little too much beer in town, and when I come home she don't say nothing. She don't ask me no questions. We always get along fine, her and me, like at first. The children don't make trouble between us, like sometimes happens. He lit another pipe and pulled on it contentedly. I found Kuzak a most companionable fellow. He asked me a great many questions about my trip through Bohemia, about Vienna, and the Ringstrasse and the theaters. Gee, I'd like to go back there once, when the boys is big enough to farm the place. And sometimes when I read the papers from the old country, I pretty near run away, he confessed with a little laugh. I never did think how I would be a settled man like this. He was still, as Antonia said, a city man. He liked theaters and lighted streets and music and a game of dominoes after the day's work was over. His sociability was stronger than his acquisitive instinct. He liked to live day by day and night by night, sharing in the excitement of the crowd. Yet his wife had managed to hold him here on a farm, in one of the loneliest countries in the world. I could see the little chap sitting here every evening by the windmill, nursing his pipe and listening to the silence, the wheeze of the pump, the grunting of the pigs, and occasional squawking when the hens were disturbed by a rat. It did rather seem to me that Kuzak had been made the instrument of Antonia's special mission. This was a fine life, certainly, but it wasn't the kind of life he had wanted to live. I wondered whether the life that was right for one was ever right for two. I asked Kuzak if he didn't find it hard to do without the gay company he had always been used to. He knocked out his pipe against an upright, sighed, and dropped it into his pocket. At first I near go crazy with lonesomeness, he said frankly, but my woman has got such a warm heart. She always make it as good for me as she could. Now it ain't so bad. I can begin to have some fun with my boys already. As we walked toward the house, Kuzak cocked his hat jauntily over one ear and looked up at the room. Gee, he said in a hushed voice, as if he had just wakened up. It don't seem like I'm away from the air 26 years. Part 3. After dinner the next day, I said goodbye and drove back to the Hastings to take the train for Blackhawk. Antonia and her children gathered round my buggy before I started, and even the little ones looked up at me with friendly faces. Leo and Ambrose ran ahead to open the lane gate. When I reached the bottom of the hill, I glanced back. The group was still there by the windmill. Antonia was waving her apron. At the gate, Ambrose lingered beside my buggy, resting his arm on the wheel rim. Leo slipped through the fence and ran off into the pasture. That's like him, his brother said with a shrug. He's a crazy kid. Maybe he's sorry to have you go, and maybe he's jealous. He's jealous of anybody Mother makes a fuss over, even the priest. I found I hated to leave this boy, with his pleasant voice and his fine head and eyes. He looked very manly as he stood there without a hat, the wind rippling his shirt about his brown neck and shoulders. Don't forget that you and Rudolph are going hunting with me up on the Niobrara next summer, I said. Your father's agreed to let you off after harvest. He smiled. I won't likely forget. I've never had such a nice thing offered to me before. I don't know what makes you so nice to us boys, he added, blushing. Oh, yes, you do, I said, gathering up my reins. He made no answer to this, except to smile at me with unabashed pleasure and affection as I drove away. My day in Black Hawk was disappointing. Most of my old friends were dead or had moved away. Strange children who meant nothing to me were playing in the Harlings' big yard when I passed. The mountain ash had been cut down, and only a sprouting stump was left of the tall Lombardy poplar that used to guard the gate. I hurried on. The rest of the morning I spent with Anton Jelinek under a shady cottonwood tree in the yard behind his saloon. While I was having my midday dinner at the hotel, I met one of the old lawyers who was still in practice, and he took me up to his office and talked over the Cutter case with me. After that, I scarcely knew how to put in the time until the night express was due. I took a long walk north of the town, out into the pastures where the land was so rough that it had never been plowed up, and the long red grass of early times still grew shaggy over the draws and hillocks. Out there, I could felt at home again. Overhead, the sky was that indescribable blue of the autumn, bright and shadowless, hard as enamel. To the south, I could see the dun-shaded river bluffs that used to look so big to me, and all about stretched drying cornfields of the pale gold color I remembered so well. Russian thistles were blowing across the uplands and piling against the wire fences like barricades. Along the cattle paths, the plumes of goldenrod were already fading into sun-warmed velvet, gray with gold threads in it. I had escaped from the curious depression that hangs over the little towns, and my mind was full of pleasant things. Trips I meant to take with the Kuzak boys in the Badlands and up on the stinking water. There were enough Kuzaks to play with for a long while yet. Even after the boys grew up, there would always be Kuzak himself. I meant to tramp along a few miles of lighted streets with Kuzak. As I wandered over these rough pastures, I had the good luck to stumble upon a bit of the first road that went from Black Hawk out to the North Country, to my grandfather's farm, then on to the Shamerdises, and to the Norwegian settlement. Everywhere else it had been plowed under when the highways were surveyed. This half mile or so within the pasture fence was all that was left of that old road, which used to run like a wild thing across the open prairie, clinging to the high places and circling and doubling like a rabbit before the hounds. On the level land, the tracks had almost disappeared, were mere shadings in the grass, and a stranger would not have noticed them. But wherever the road had crossed a draw, it was easy to find. The rains had made channels of the wheel ruts and washed them so deep that the sod had never healed over them. They looked like gashes torn by a grizzly's claws on the slopes where the farm wagons used to lurch up out of the hollows with a pull that brought curling muscles on the smooth hips of the horses. I sat down and watched the haystacks turn rosy in the slanting sunlight. This was the road over which Antonia and I came on that night, when we got off the train at Black Hawk and were bedded down in the straw, wandering children, being taken we knew not whither. I had only to close my eyes to hear the rumbling of the wagons in the dark and to be again overcome by that obliterating strangeness. The feelings of that night were so near that I could reach out and touch them with my hand. I had the sense of coming home to myself and of having found what a little circle man's experience is. For Antonia and for me, this had been the road of destiny, had taken us to those early accidents of fortune which predetermined for us all that we ever can be. Now I understood that the same road was to bring us together again. Whatever we had missed, we possessed together the precious, the incommunicable past. The end. The end of my Antonia by Willa Cather. This was quite an interesting read to me, and I gotta say, prior to doing a little bit of reading here, just in these farm sim videos, the whole thing is about trying to exercise my voice, but I found it very interesting to read this, and until trying this, I had never heard of Willa Cather, haven't ever heard of the book My Antonia, and, published in 1918, so this, I'm trying to remember when the First World War was, probably right around that time, would have been when this book was published, and she was speaking of a time that is totally outside of my lifetime, of course, and probably everybody listening to this. I think Willa herself lived until into the 40s, or 1940s, but she spoke of a time, in our country that was just totally different, from how it is now, where, and I can't hardly fathom that, really. I live in Oregon on the West Coast, and I've been into both sides of the U.S. and a lot of places in between. And there is still a lot of rough country out there. Not everything is developed, of course. Matter of fact, a lot of it isn't. But, in the century that follows this, it's a totally different place, than what it was depicted in this book. So it's really interesting to read, putting on, today's eyes. I read this during 2025, to look back as to how things looked, or what was going on over 100 years ago. And, it mentions cars barely towards the end of this narrative, because really the book is kind of spanning a lifetime of this Jim Burden, I think his name was. He grew up in this little town, and then eventually I think moved on to New York City. That was kind of something curious for me to try to figure out at the get-go with this book. It's written by a woman but she, enough episodes have gone by, maybe don't remember the first that I read. Kind of had an introduction, and it's kind of in the author's voice, and she says, she had talked with a friend of hers, Jim Burden, and they wanted to write something about my Antonia, and she said that he came up with a narrative, and that's what was used. Now, I'm assuming this is just poetic license taken by the author, and that she is the one that wrote it all, even though she said it came from, this Jim Burden. But all through the air, he's relating a span of years. Oh, I don't know, maybe 40, 50 years, if I had to guess, of what's probably the latter 1800s in the U.S., maybe into the early 1900s. I don't know my history well enough to know. Well, I think it was the early 1900s when automobiles started to be a thing. There might have been some before the turn of the century, but to where they would be commonly available, to citizens and spoken of, in a book like this, probably was into the early 1900s. The telephone was mentioned. That's, I believe that's older than the car, but I should have looked it up maybe before recording this. I don't remember what year that came to be, and probably even that. It probably was a while before it became commonplace, and so you see kind of a shift, in the story where you start at the beginning and then towards the end, you're hearing about cars, you're hearing about the phone, telephone, and whatnot, and when you look at the past history of the last 100 years, there definitely was a whole lot more that has happened and folks have gone through than the 100 years before. And it's just fascinating to see the change over time. Even now, with all in the era of smartphones and, new technology coming, AI, it's, for older people like me, and if I consider myself in that crowd, I remember when we had none of that stuff. When there was no such thing as an internet, or at least not that us little people knew about. And it must have been similar, to people that lived in this era, just different. You grew up maybe without a telephone, and then all of a sudden one day the thing exists. And then once you use it for a while, you don't know how you ever survived without it. And I think we see kind of a picture of that in the story. It provides a number of pictures. I mean, there's not enough time really to get into all of them, but I'm sure you noticed my my attempt to mimic an accent. I have no idea if I'm anywhere close. I'm not a linguistic expert. I just chose to get, for, I think Antonia was Bohemian, and I'm not 100% sure where she came from. I rolled my R's, I made an accent. It's it's probably not based on anything, but it was kind of fun to try, as a matter of reading. But in reality, virtually everybody we were reading about in this story were immigrants. And so by all rights, everybody talking except for maybe the youngest children. Kids have a way of figuring out languages and how to speak, without an accent. I'll never forget, years ago, there was a Russian family that moved into our area from the Ukraine, and they had a family, several children came with them, and they spoke no English at all. They spoke only Russian, and I remember our family helped them learn a few English words, and it just took them a while, to learn a new language, as you would expect. But of course, the kids picked it up very quickly, especially the youngest one, their little Vitaly. I still remember him. He picked it up the quickest of all. And I told his parents once, that he spoke English just like anyone else. I told him, "Pies accentum," without accent. And so maybe here in Willa Cather's story, some of the youngest kids would speak English with no accent. But we heard of Bohemians, we heard of Norwegians, and I'm doubtless several other ethnicities or what have you, where people, I mean, there was a lot of immigrants, in those days. There still are. But it's just interesting seeing the mix of them kind of in the story, and how they each had kind of their own communities. And I think that's similar today when people move here or to some nation from another country. It's only natural that they would associate with their own for a while, where they understand the language of each other's customs. It probably helps ease their entry, to another country. And you see something else in here too, and again, I don't know my history well enough to articulate this, only that it existed. The U.S. was a large country and a vast open middle. Some of it was eventually broken into by railroads, and land was given to the railroads, and which was and sold to people on either side of it to help fund the construction of the railway. And so that's how people would pick up land, or some of it was given to them, through the Homestead Act. And as I understand it, that act is still open to this day. But I don't think in the central part of the U.S. you could have it anymore. Maybe up in Alaska, where you could pick up, what was it, 180 acres? Or was it a section? A section is 640. I'm not sure on that. So you just know that the immigrants here were maybe picking some of that up. You could hear kind of towards the end of this how much work, if you were going to get granted the land, you had to farm it, to develop it, to turn it into something productive. That's something we don't appreciate now that the nation is developed. All the people that worked so hard before, and before they had the tools and technology to do so, I might add. They put all this in, and you get a flavor of that in reading this book. So lots of immigrants, languages, and I wonder about some of the characters themselves. This Jim Burden, who ran off to New York, he obviously had an affection of some kind for Antonia, but he never married her. Actually there was several ladies that he ran into, and just, I don't know, it's just maybe the familiarity was too much growing up together. He just couldn't see a romantic interest with them. That part was kind of curious to me. As much as he said he appreciated or had affection for these ladies, he never ended up with one of them. I don't even know if he's married, in the book. He might still be single. That was kind of curious to me. It also gave a picture of, and asked kind of a philosophical question towards the end, as they presented Antonia and Cusack's marriage, and calling him, Cusack, a city man at heart. And yet here he was a farmer. And not just a farmer, he was expanding it, and just his acceptance of it. It seems like today so many are discontent, and life is tough. We don't get our way on everything, but it seems finding contentment is so difficult for us, when we have so many options. Maybe we always think that there's something better out there. And, to this Cusack, he seemed pretty happy. He was having children, he loved his wife, and every now and again he'd wander off to the city and get drink a little too much, and she let him have a little bit of fun that way. But his heart was otherwise on the farm and providing for his family. And I admire that kind of contentment where your spouses work together instead of being totally antagonistic to each other. That's something, we in our modern era could learn. Everybody's so quick to just separate company from those that they disagree with. And I guess another point I take from the book is the impact that every person we come in contact with in our life that has on us. We've all heard the expression, it takes a village to raise a child. And, I used to think that wasn't true, but I do see some truth in that. Whether it's a teacher, a pastor, a parent. Of course, parents are going to be primary in that position, but everybody you are with, good or bad, has an impact in shaping the kind of people, that we turn out to be. And it's, you just see that illustrated in this story and the impact, that it was on the so-called author Jim Burden, with all these people that he knew from the days of his youth. So, and then a good dose of nostalgia. And I mean, that would be a topic for another time, but you can see it here as he's looking at that old road kind of at the end, how he missed the former times. So, all in all, a wonderful read, and I will see you on the next one.